So to start, can you just share a quick sketch of your background and as part of that, touch on why you felt compelled enough to kind of get out of venture and decide to found a company?
Sure. It wasn't as, I'd say, premeditated as that. My background is venture capital. Been working in the industry for 22 years. I still work in it, albeit in a very different capacity than before R0. And ultimately, COVID hit me really hard, is probably the best way to put it. For me, it reminded me a lot of the same emotions I had around 9/11. Obviously, a very different set of circumstances, but it felt like another moment in time where everything was about to change. It really hit me. There is a moment I often think about, and it was in early March. I went to a local Whole Foods and I just saw fright in people's eyes. You couldn't buy toilet paper, you couldn't buy paper towels. I saw people with full medical scrubs, and I was like, wow, okay, this is real. And at that point, there was still no concept of R0, but I was using my home office for the very first time in my entire life. My daughter, who was 11 at that point, was doing school at home. The streets in Los Gatos were totally quiet. And I just started thinking to myself that there's got to be some organization out there that knows how to deal with pathogens because, ever since the advent of humans, we've had pathogens. And so I, for whatever reason, started thinking about hospitals. Again, not thinking I was going to start a company, but it was more intellectual curiosity, given that is a communal gathering place for sick people. And generally speaking, when you go to the hospital, you don't end up getting all of the other pathogens that are in the four walls. It felt like maybe there's some lesson that can be learned that would get my daughter back in school, would get me back in my office, and hopefully help prevent the spread of COVID. And so I started to research infection prevention in hospitals. There's a fair amount written about it. It's really not that complex. The way they think about risk is against three dimensions. It's hands, air, and surfaces. Very little in the way of technology that's been brought to mitigate the risk of pathogen spread. But what little technology that does exist looks something like this. And it is, tends to be UVC based in nature. So I'm reading about UVC light. I don't know much about it. I'm not an engineer by training. I've spent enough time in technology that I'm comfortable around it. But I start researching UVC, and what I learned is it's incredibly old. So the Nobel Prize in Medicine was awarded to someone named Niels Finsen in 1903 for his work with germicidal UV. It's been used to treat wastewater since the 1910s, HVAC since the 1920s, and it works so well, it's still used in that exact same capacity today. The reason for that is there's no pathogen on the face of the earth that has any resistance to UVC light. Unlike chemicals, which over time can build resistance to the chemical itself, UVC light is inactivating the pathogen at the RNA and the DNA level. So as long as the laws of physics remain, this system and others like it will be able to disinfect anything. That to me felt like, wow, okay, so the solution might be as simple as products like this being utilized to disinfect the air and surfaces in all of these environments that are struggling to deal with COVID. I can tell you definitively, I think I was looking for an investment for Tenaya. That's the venture capital firm I co-founded and am a GP in. And so what is very natural to me is market mapping. Once you have a thesis around an opportunity, be it a market or an emerging technology, the key then is to start trying to understand who are all the vendors in this space. What do the products look like? What are some of the strengths, the weaknesses? And so that was basically a spreadsheet that I pulled together. And in doing so, what I came to realize was there were a number of vendors. Most of them were pretty old, not a lot of innovation, and their products were incredibly expensive. I also learned that their products have incredible bodies of evidence. And what I mean by that is the hospitals that have adopted technologies like this have seen a tremendous reduction in what are called HAIs, or hospital-acquired infections. These are secondary infections. So think, go in for a knee surgery, you come out with a staph infection. You go in for an MRI, you catch C. diff. As it turns out, my North Star, which was hospitals, do struggle with pathogens and they do struggle with infections. But the ones that tend to do best utilize systems like this to do a whole room disinfection. And what they're disinfecting is both the air and the surfaces. And so The body of evidence was rich. The products looked really interesting. They were very expensive. I reached out around this time, and this was probably the beginning of the second week in March, to the former head of product and engineering for one of my portfolio companies. It was a mobile marketplace, provided technical workers to come to your house or your place of work to fix an iPhone screen or install a Nest thermostat. And I had always remembered he was a very talented employee, but I always remembered he had a very non-traditional background for the head of product and engineering for a mobile marketplace. He's a mechanical engineer by training. He worked at Abbott right out of college, building medical devices. And then he went to a medical device startup and ran the neurovascular value chain. And so I reached out to him and I said, hey, Grant, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm using my home office. There's no one on the streets, but I'm doing a bunch of research into UVC light. It appears as though this is the gold standard for disinfection within hospitals and primarily being utilized in the highest risk environment, which is the surgical theater. Are you interested in digging in with me? And he said, sure. And so I shared with him all of the work that I had done. And I said, do you have any idea why these things are so expensive? There's a company in our space that sells their product for $125,000. And he said, I have no idea, but let me dig around. And it was probably 2 or 3 days later. I don't remember exactly. Everything sort of over the course of the past year blurs together. But he just said, it's just a light with a timer. It shouldn't cost that much. And he had actually sketched out on a napkin what he thought a product should do and what it should look like. And it looks pretty similar to this. And he said, look, I think we can sell the thing for, call it a fifth of the cost of these other units. And I think we can have incredible margins. And I said, well, this is awesome and very exciting, but you're obviously missing something. There's got to be some reason why that's a $125,000 product and you just haven't figured it out. My venture hat was on. I said, we've got to do more due diligence and we've got to find someone that actually understands this market. We networked our way into a conversation with someone named Dr. Richard Wade. Dr. Wade ran Cal OSHA for more than a decade. He taught at Harvard and Oxford. And when we spoke to him, he was the principal scientist at an environmental health and safety consulting practice called Omega. And in that role, he wrote the disinfection protocols to reopen Blackstone's offices. And he wrote the disinfection protocols for the Diamond Princess boat. And so we pitched him on this idea and he loved it. He said, look, I've been using UVC in labs for decades. It is incredible. I think its moment is now. And it has just a tremendous number of advantages when compared to chemicals. And we said, well, that's great, Dr. Wade, but what are we missing? Why is it that companies like Xenex sell their product for $125,000 and we think we can build a better version of that and sell it for a fifth of that cost? And he said, you're not missing anything. He said, pricing in this market is really just an artifact of our screwed up healthcare system. It's the reason why when you need stitches and you go into the ER, it could cost $2,000. He said, it really comes down to how expensive HAIs are for hospitals. And as it turns out, HAIs are incredibly painful, both for the patient, the family, as well as the hospital. So these are top 10 leading killers in the US every year. And they'll cost a hospital anywhere from $20,000 to $40,000 to remediate. So the industry has really evolved around this concept of, look, if we save you 3 to 4 HAIs, it pays for this $125,000 piece of hardware. And when we understood that and we recognized that we could build a better product, we decided to go start the company. We recruited a third co-founder, a brilliant guy named Eli Harris. Eli co-founded a company called EcoFlow, which just became a unicorn and had recently moved back from China. And so the three of us sat down and decided to go forward with the business, call it in late March. And ultimately, my initial thought with it was I would seed the company and be an active board member. But what ultimately happened is I realized there's a much bigger opportunity than helping organizations deal with COVID. And that's disinfection is just broken. It's a giant industry. It's dominated by 100 to 150-year-old chemical companies like Ecolab and Clorox. Their products are horrible for people. So there's been countless exposure lawsuits. It's terrible for the environment. They're incredibly carbon intensive to transport, but the manufacturing process is also horrible. They create superbugs because of resistance. But above and beyond all of those big challenges, they don't do what you think they do. COVID as a virus tends to spread through the air. So applying more Clorox to a school or in an office environment, it's not doing anything. If you're focused on bacterial infections, they do in fact spread on surfaces. But how often are you seeing E. coli and salmonella outbreaks in schools or in an office? And so ultimately, the three of us sat down and just said, this whole thing is messed up. And if the goal of disinfection is infection prevention, you really have to address air and surfaces and do so in occupied spaces. And so that really became the mission of the company. And we started working on products that provide that even before we had launched this product. And we launched those in Q4.